So our next guest speaker will be talking about, her talk is about designing a high-performing team by Alison Coward, founder at Bracket, author of A Pocket Guide to Effective Workshops. She is also a public speaker as workshop facilitator. A warm round of applause for Alison Coward.
Thank you. Okay, so a question for you. How do you do your best work? Because this question, knowing this about yourself and also knowing this about the people that you work with, is the key to designing a high-performing team. And this is the kind of thing that I do with the teams that I work with. So my main aim with the teams that I work with is that they can create an environment where everybody can perform at their best and do their best work. And this is quite important because teamwork is changing. It's not like what it was. You know, the kind of words that we're using to describe teams nowadays are things like dynamic, fluid, self-managing, autonomous. All of these signal that we're moving in and out of teams much more frequently. Things are moving much faster. You know, the problems that we have to solve need to be solved by multidisciplinary teams that work together quite quickly. And, you know, there's research that shows that now, EY I think it was, says that 90% of us are working in teams. You'll be familiar with this. 90% of us are working in teams, but not only that, 95% of us work across multiple teams. So we're not only working in teams more frequently, we're actually part of more than one team, which means that we need to have the knowledge and the understanding of what makes teams work. How do we make our teams work effectively? How do we kick off projects? How do we make them work well? So when you think of team building, you probably think of something like this. You know, and that's okay. You know, the assault course, the one-off yearly assault course that we go to, or paintballing, or something fun where our team get together and have a bit of a laugh together. And that's okay, but this should not be the only way that we see team building. In fact, team building should look a lot more like this. It should be part of our everyday work. It should just be natural. It should be something that we do every single day. Team building should be teamwork, should be team building. And there's also no one-size-fits-all as well. It's more important for us to become knowledgeable about what makes teams work because every team is different. Not only is a team made up of a set of individuals, all with their own expertise, skills, knowledge, thoughts, ideas, opinions. When you put those individuals together in a team, then that team's going to have its own culture because of the individuals in it. And then when you put them within the context of a project, that project brings certain challenges. And then the environment that they work in means that there's no one-size-fits-all for the way that we work together. We need to have the fluency and the knowledge of what it takes to build teams, to make them effective, and to keep that momentum going as well. And this comes down to 3 principles for me. So, you know, we need to think about how we work together in teams, but there's also a mindset shift to be done. There's also a mindset shift that we have to go through to think in this way, to think about this new way of working. So the first one, in forms of questions again, do you think that your team can learn to work better together? Do you believe that actually collaboration is a skill? This comes down to something called growth mindset. So a psychologist called Carol Dweck came up with this idea of the fact that there's 2 different types of mindsets. There's a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. People with a fixed mindset believe that talent is fixed, it's natural, you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, then you can't improve. People with a growth mindset believe that, you know, some people are naturally talented, but actually anybody that has patience, persistence, engages in practice, can learn to get better at anything. And she says this is mainly applied to individuals, so you'll see it applied a lot to kind of the sports world, music performers, those kinds of things. And that's primarily what she developed the theory around. But she then also did do some research in teams as well. She did an experiment, and she gave 2 teams, one with a fixed mindset, one with a growth mindset, the same task to work on. The teams with the growth mindset, by far, outperformed the teams with a fixed mindset. And that was because the teams in the fixed mindset didn't want to challenge each other. They didn't want to speak up because they were afraid of looking stupid in front of each other. Remember that they think that talent is fixed. So if they make a mistake in front of other people, then that shatters their dream of the fact that they're naturally talented. On the other hand, the team with a growth mindset, because they felt comfortable to challenge each other and they actually learned from mistakes rather than seeing them as a failure, they went on to outperform the team with a fixed mindset by far. So does your team have a fixed mindset with regards to collaboration and the way that you can work together, or do you have a growth mindset? Second principle, what new ways of working can you create together? Now this comes down to the idea that, again, there's no one size fits all. And I see designing teamwork as a design skill. The way that we work, the tools and the processes that we use to develop great products for our clients and users are the same tools that we can turn internally on our team to figure out new ways of working. See yourself and your colleagues as users of your own experience and design a process that works for the way that you work together. This is a creative task. It's a problem to be solved. It's creative. You're thinking about what problem you can solve. You're experimenting as well. And you're also thinking about how can we work more innovatively together? Because if you can find ways of working innovatively together, then you're more likely to go on to develop innovative products as well. The final principle, how will you and your team start to work differently? Now this is interesting because this is the piece that a lot of teams forget about, and it's about changing behaviour. We all have innate habits ourselves individually. We may be aware of them or not, but also our teams have habits, routines and rituals that we work to. And being aware of those team habits, routines and rituals as a first step enables us to look at them critically and then decide whether we need to change them or build or break better habits for us to work better together. Because that's what teamwork is. It's a set of habits that we all have in the way that we work together. So those three principles, can your team learn to work better together? Can you take a design approach to the way that you work? And how do you change behaviour? How do you build new team habits? Now, when you're designing your team, when you're designing for a high-performing team, there's two factors that you want to design around. Whenever I've done work with teams, any challenge that a team has always comes down to these two factors. Any problem, strip it back all the way to its original core, and you'll find it'll be one of these two things. Communication and trust. Now, this comes down to the fact that how you work together is more important than what you're working on and even who you're working with. And I'm going to stop and pause for a second for you to read that again. How you work together is more important than what you are working on and who you're working with. Which sounds really odd to say, doesn't it? We focus a lot on the content that we produce, and we think that's what's going to get us the innovative results. But there's research that shows, time and time again, research has showed that the how you work together is way more important than what you're working on and who you're working with. And I'm going to share a couple of the bits of those research with you now. So the first one, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They have a lab, Human Dynamics, and they look regularly into how we work together and the interactions that we have. And back in 2012, they did some research. They asked teams to wear wearable devices, and they tracked the level and the patterns of communication. Important to say that they didn't track what was being said, they only tracked the patterns of communication. And they found that there were 4 factors across the most high-performing teams that had in common. And these were: the most high-performing teams, the most effective teams, were communicating frequently. They talked and listened in equal measure. So there was no one person that was dominating the conversation. There was equality across the whole team. They also engaged in frequent informal communication. So it wasn't just about work, work, work. They were kind of socialising and having social chats as well. And the other thing which is interesting is that they could tell that the conversation between the teams was dynamic. It wasn't kind of monotonous. There was a lot of interaction. And again, as I say, they weren't monitoring what was being said. They were only monitoring how they were actually communicating. Next bit of research. So this is the bit of research that Marcus referred to, that I wouldn't let him reveal so that you would all come to my talk. a couple of years ago, Google did some research into their own high-performing teams. So they realised that there was kind of differences in performance across the teams, and they wanted to study the teams that were high-performing, were most high-performing, and try to identify what it was so that they could start to replicate it. And they did lots of research across all of the teams, and they thought they'd come up with things like, the IQ of the team members, where those people went to school, the particular technical expertise of the members in the team. And it had nothing to do with, again, who was in the team, and it all came down to these 5 factors. So the most important factors for high-performing teams at Google was that the individual team members could feel that their work was making an impact. They could see that there was an impact to their work. They could also see the meaning. They knew why they were doing what they were doing. They could see how it contributed to the bigger picture. And actually that's related to what the previous speakers mentioned about in terms of autonomy, mastery and purpose, this idea of purpose, being able to see how your work fits into the bigger picture. There was structure and clarity. We all know that's important when we're working together in a team. And dependability. They knew that they could rely on their team members. But right at the top of the list was this idea of psychological safety. This was the factor that indicated the highest performing teams at Google. Psychological safety is the idea that you can feel safe enough to be vulnerable, take risks, and make mistakes in front of your team members. Psychological safety. So nothing to do with how good the work is or how good the people are, and everything to do with how they work together and how they trusted each other. So those 2 factors, communication and trust, designing new ways of working, these are the things to design around. How can you communicate more effectively, and how do you build more trust within your team? It seems like a lot. There's a lot of research out there, and there's a lot of places to get information on this. But where do you start? You start here. I'm going to ask you a question, actually. I want to see a show of hands. How many of you in this room would say that you're self-aware? You're aware of yourself, self-aware. Okay, so I'd say that's probably about 20%. Okay, so a researcher, Dr. Tasha Eurich, he's written a book called Insight, which is all about self-awareness. She believes that self-awareness is going to be the meta skill of the 21st century. We need to become more self-aware. So when she did her research, she asked a lot of people how self-aware they were, whether they thought they were self-aware. Turns out that 95% of us think we're self-aware. And when she actually investigated that, she found that the truth of people that are actually really self-aware is closer to 10 to 15%. Which is quite funny, isn't it? Actually, we're not self-aware enough to know that we're not self-aware. Think about that. So we've got some work to do. And I'm going to give you a place to start. So I like the idea of doing teamwork user manuals. It came from someone called Ivor Cogred, who was a technology leader at a firm called Questback. And he was interviewed by Adam Bryant at the New York Times, who does lots of interviews with leaders or organisations to find out how they work. And he said that he does this thing called a teamwork user manual. So he writes down basically a manual for himself, like an IKEA manual. And every time someone joins his team, or he joins a new team, he'll hand them this user manual. Say, this is how I like to work. These are the things that irritate me. This is how I do my best work. And they'd navigate around how they would work best together. Lots of different questions that you can ask yourself to do that. But these are some of the questions that you might want to think about. When are your most productive hours? You might want to think about, are you a night owl? Are you an early bird? When do you get up? When do you get through your tasks really, really efficiently? When do you get your best ideas? When are you most creative? I find that I'm most creative first thing in the morning. Before I've checked my emails or anything like that, I need to get on with my work straight away. What does your ideal workday look like? Now, I admit that most of us don't have the luxury to actually design our workday, but it's absolutely important, right? If we know that we get our best ideas in the morning and we're tied up with meetings every single morning, when are we going to get our best ideas? You can also kind of ask questions to yourself, what's the best way to communicate with me? How do I like to communicate? Just get that self-awareness about yourself. And this is the kind of thing that you would do individually, but also across your team. And when you have those results, you'll have discussions with your team about how do we navigate the best way to work with each other based on this knowledge that we now have of each other. So self-awareness. Now, better meetings and workshops. So there's lots of different ways in which you can design the way that you work together. I feel that one of the places that we can make a massive difference is in the way that we meet. And it's often kind of not thought about as much as it can be. Why do we need to think about it? There are lots of stats out there about unproductive meetings, but this is one of them. Apparently in the US, $37 billion is wasted on unproductive meetings every year. And you'll probably think that most of that money is spent at your organisation. Not quite. But we do need to do something about it. So how do you make your meetings count? So I've found that when I work with teams, often what happens, I mean, it may be different in the way that you work, because I know that you have certain workshops that you run regularly, but often what I find with teams that I work with is that what will happen is that a team member will say, we need to meet, we need to speak. They'll block time off in the diary, they'll book a room, they'll get into the room, and then they'll start talking. And every single meeting will be planned like that. Well, every meeting is not equal, every meeting is different. If you look at all of the meetings that you have, every single meeting has probably got a different purpose. So the first thing that you need to do when you're calling the meeting with your team is identify what the purpose of that meeting is. And then once you've identified the purpose of that meeting, then you think about the best format for it. You know, it may be a quick status update that you need to do, which is 5 minutes. You may need to do a retrospective, which may be an hour. You may need to do a brainstorming session, which could take a couple of hours. You may need to do a strategy session, which could be half a day, a whole day. These all have different formats. So the thing that you need to do will be based on the purpose of the meeting, and you'll design that meeting accordingly. And then the final thing is you'll start to see, when you start to look at your meetings holistically and what you need to meet for and why you need to meet, you'll start to see that there's a rhythm to the way that you work. There'll be meetings that you hold regularly. Some may be every day, some may be every week, some may be quarterly, some may even be yearly. But this cadence, this meeting cadence, is what's going to keep your team together. It's almost like the heartbeat of your team. And being aware of that, again, will help your team to think about how you can become more effective. What do you need to discuss and when? And how do we need to discuss it? How can we make sure we get the best out of everybody in the room? I'm going to give you a few examples of some teams, companies that you might consider as high performing, and some meetings that they've designed based on that. So Google Ventures, this is actually from a couple of years ago, and this idea of anxiety parties was written about by Jake Knapp, who is one of the co-authors of the book Sprint. And when he and his team were working at Google Ventures, they found that they were getting on well, they were kind of, doing great work, and they were enjoying their work, but they were missing something. Because they were quite a flat team, they didn't have any line managers, so they were missing that feedback that you get from having someone to check into. And because they were missing that feedback, they were starting to get a little bit anxious about their own performance. So they decided to call a meeting called anxiety parties. And it was twice a year, I think it was every quarter or twice a year. What they would do is they'd get together and they would list all the things that they were feeling anxious about their performance. And then they would ask their team members, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of an issue is this to you? And their team members would rate it. So for some things that they thought perhaps weren't an issue, they were to their team members, so they could adjust it. And for some things that they thought were a real big problem, it wasn't to their team members at all. So they had these ideas of anxiety parties, which I quite like. Another example, again, this is actually Braden Coates, who's also ex-Google Ventures, probably something about Google Ventures, actually, probably something to do with the fact that they wrote this book Sprint, which is basically a week-long meeting, a week-long workshop. Braden Coates now has his own startup called Range Labs. It's a technology firm that helps, creates tools to help teams work better together. And he wrote about this really simple intervention that he did called a check-in round. And a check-in round is so simple, it almost hurts. A check-in round, all you do at the beginning of a meeting, before you start talking about work, is you take 5 minutes to ask your team a question. And that question is often unrelated to your work. So it could be, what's the biggest thing on your mind? What's worrying you? What are you most looking forward to this year? How was your weekend? How was your journey into work? And every person around the table will take turns to answer it. And that's it. Simple check-in round, just something personal to get to know your team members. But Braden Coates found that this had such a massive impact on the performance of his team. This is what he says. The more honest we are with each other, the better we work together. And that's why check-in rounds are one of the best ways to get higher output from your team. So what was happening here, in that 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting, they were creating that psychological safety, which, as we know, goes on to help teams become high-performing. Just 5 minutes, tiny, tiny thing at the beginning of a meeting. And then there's also the meetings that we don't have. So Google Ventures Anxiety Parties was the type of meeting. The Range Labs check-in rounds is what you do in meetings, and then maybe actually assessing whether you have meetings at all. Well, we do need meetings, but when you have those meetings. So Asana, again, another tool for team productivity. You would think that they've got quite a good knowledge about what makes teams work and what makes teams productive. They found that actually the performance of people across the organisation was suffering because everyone was getting pulled into meetings too frequently. And they weren't having long stretches of time to really focus on their work, what we call deep work. Cal Newport wrote a book called Deep Work. It's all about focused, uninterrupted time, something that we find really difficult in this day and age with constant interruptions. So they instigated this idea of no meeting Wednesdays. Every Wednesday, they would agree not to have any internal meetings, so the whole company could spend time focusing on their work and just getting into that concentrated work that they needed to be able to develop their craft. So 3 examples there. Now there's lots of ways, there's lots of tips out there as to how you can make your meetings better. My personal way and my personal opinion on this, and I am biased because I've written a book on workshops, is that we can take inspiration from workshops. There's so much that happens in a well-facilitated workshop that we can take to make our meetings run better. And I've seen it. I've seen it in the teams that I work with. When we start to do this, I call this a workshop culture. So it's where, you may have a one-off workshop, which is great, and within that workshop, you're highly productive because it's planned well, facilitated well, it's highly productive, you get really great output, really great content, and you think, we should do this more frequently. So then you start to run a series of workshops throughout projects, but there's still kind of a bit of a delineation between the work that you do and workshops. What I call a workshop culture is when the ways of workshops are integrated into every aspect of the way that you work. So a great workshop, it's characterised by great collaboration, creativity, everybody's getting involved, everyone's engaged, you've got high motivation, there's great output that comes from it, the team has clarity. That's the kind of thing that we need with our teams anyway. So why do we confine that way of working just to a workshop? Let's start to spread it out and see how it can impact the other parts of our work. So here are some tips on how to make your meetings count from taking inspiration from workshops. I would say that probably you do some of these things, but sometimes it's good to have it all together. So the first one, have a facilitator. A facilitator there in a workshop is there to be an observer and to guide the process. They're not there to be involved in developing the content or contributing ideas in any way. They are someone who takes a step back and looks at the overall picture and makes sure that the team is progressing towards the goal. A facilitator in your meeting, as opposed to just workshops, can make a massive difference because you've got that biased view. And the facilitator can make sure that everybody around the room is having the opportunity to get involved and there's equal contributions. No one person is dominating the conversation is staying focused. And a facilitator will also own that process as well. So they'll design the workshop or the meeting, they'll facilitate it, and they'll also be responsible for the follow-up afterwards. What happens after the meeting or the workshop? How do we make sure we turn these ideas into action and we integrate them into our work? So that's the first tip. Second tip, make it dynamic. There's no reason that just because we're having a meeting as opposed to a workshop, we have to sit around a table and just listen to people talk. We can get up and use the walls and use post-it notes and make things and prototype. There's actually research that shows that when people are standing up in meetings and when people use their hands in meetings, they're more productive. So again, we can take this inspiration from workshops, using post-it notes and little tools to kind of keep us engaged and focused on the work that we're doing. Give people time to think individually. Again, in your meetings, it's sometimes a free-for-all. Whoever's the loudest gets to speak. Whoever's the most dominant gets to speak. Whoever's the most senior in the room gets to speak. But there are different types of personalities in a team. Some people are more introverted, which means they like to have time to think before they speak. Some people are more extroverted, which means that they speak in order to form their ideas. And what happens is that the extroverted team members look like they're dominating the conversation because the introverts need time to catch up. So if you give people time to think individually, give everyone a stack of post-it notes, ask a question, give them time to think individually before they start to discuss in a group, you're going to equal out that conversation a lot more. And there's no reason why that has to be confined to workshops. You can bring that into meetings. The other thing that I see, and this is one of the reasons why I see meetings are so unproductive and they go around in circles, is this idea of separating out what is called divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is all about exploring possibilities, creativity, coming up with ideas, generating lots of ideas. Whereas convergent thinking is about closing in on a few that you might select to move forward with. By nature, convergent thinking, you need to start to apply criteria to it. You need to be a bit critical about those ideas. You can't do both at the same time because they interfere with each other. If you bring convergent thinking in too early when you're generating ideas, then what happens is those ideas get shut down too early. They don't have time to breathe. At the same time, if you've decided that you're going to start making decisions and someone's still trying to generate ideas, you're just going around in a discussion loop and everyone gets frustrated. So in your meetings, in your workshops, you want to make sure that you're dividing up divergent and convergent thinking. You've got separate activities for the two, and your discussions will be much more focused. Related to this as well is that you want to make space for productive conflict. High-performing teams feel safe to challenge each other. It's not about agreeing with each other, it's not about groupthink, it's about challenging each other in a safe way, because that's how ideas get better. A lot of us are scared of conflict because we think it's bad. People-based conflict is not good. Task-based conflict, ideas-based conflict is excellent within the realm of creativity and innovation. And the way to do that is just to make space for it. In the same way that you would make space for generating creative ideas and convergent thinking, making decisions, you want to make space for productive conflict. So you might have a brainstorming session, and then you will say, okay, brainstorming session, just about coming up with as many ideas as possible. Now we need to move into critical mode. Let's criticize these ideas, let's make them better, let's challenge each other. A really great example of this is Pixar. So Pixar have a meeting specifically for productive conflicts. They're called brain trusts. And what happens is that when an animator, Pixar the animation company by the way, so when a producer is working on a script, they will have a brain trust and they'll bring the script along and there'll be a range of experts around the room. And the role of those experts from different places across the organisation is to pick that script apart in order to make it better. Now, it's up to the producer whether they take on those ideas or not, but the point is there's a specific space made for productive conflict, a safe space where it's okay to challenge each other's ideas. Super, super important for innovation. So now I want to move on to team habits. So this is, again, as I say, something that we don't really think about in terms of the way that we work. Every team, whether you're aware of them or not, will have your own habits. Habits, routines, rituals. So the idea is to make yourself aware of them. There's lots of different ways that you can design habits around, or the habits that you might have. We've looked at how you meet, different ways of meeting. It may be how you share ideas. So how do you share creativity? How do you share the new ideas that you have? One example of this is Etsy. You heard of this aspect of their culture that they have. So Etsy have this ritual or habit, whatever you want to call it. Every time a developer makes a mistake, they have to send a company-wide email documenting that mistake. And the idea is not to assign blame or to make someone look stupid. It's just so that everybody else in the organisation doesn't make that same mistake, which makes sense, right? You want to learn from others' mistakes and not repeat it. Again, another type of culture where you need to have a really high level of psychological safety to be able to do that. Social time, how do you get together? How do you, we saw that in the MIT research that informal communication is an important part of building an effective team. So what interventions do you create? What kinds of spaces do you create for your team to get to know each other? One example, another one for you, Marcus, you'll know this one. So in Sweden, they have a tradition called fika, and the idea is that every day around 11 and or 3 p.m, a team will move away from their work and they'll have coffee and pastries together. And the whole idea is that you don't talk about work at all. You literally use it to kind of catch up with each other and get to know each other. So fika is something that you can do within your organisation or some aspects of it. Everyone okay? Is that something you can't do? What's going on? Sorry? It's close to home. Okay, great. Okay, so also we saw with the sauna that they needed to create space for people to do work that they could focus on and concentrate on. So as well as the times that you meet and the times that you work together, what spaces are you creating for people to work on their own and just get on with their work? This is all stuff that you can design. It doesn't have to happen by accident. You can be intentional about it. If you want a high-performing team, then you need to think about the ways in which people can perform highly and design around that. But all of those examples I've given you kind of relates to the conversation we're having before, but don't copy these. You know, back to that diagram that I gave you, every team has its own context. You're a unique set of individuals. With those set of individuals, you'll create your own unique team culture, and the project that you're working in creates another context. So you want to design your own ways of working that works for you. And it comes down to changing behaviour. So it's not just about saying, right, we want to collaborate more effectively, we want to communicate more effectively. This is the piece, as I say, that people tend to forget about. We come up with the ideas for how we're going to work together, but we don't actually think about how we're going to do it and how we're actually going to take that action. Think about habits that you're trying to create for yourself, or you're trying to break for yourself. Think about how difficult that is for you to change your own behaviour. Imagine trying to do that as a team. You have to be intentional about it. It's a really good example. How do you change behaviour? You change it by 1%. Has anyone heard of the Team Sky, Dave Brailsford example? So Dave Brailsford was brought in to turn around the British cycling team. And what he did to do that was, across the whole team, he made changes of 1%. He didn't come in and make sweeping changes. He changed tiny little things across a series of areas. So things like the tyres, how the players wash their hands, the pillows that they slept on, tiny little interventions that, when added up, made a massive difference. So this is the way that you want to look at it. You don't want to kind of say, right, okay, we've got to collaborate better. We're going to have all these meetings. Actually, what's the tiniest, smallest tweak that you can make that is going to have a big impact, that is almost non-threatening to people to change, the easiest thing for them to change, and then monitor that. This idea of implementation intention as well, a bit of research that shows that when people want to change their behaviour and they make an action plan of what that behaviour is and when they're going to do it, they're more likely to enact that behaviour. So again, this is what you want to do with your team. When you've decided a new way of working, actually make a commitment to making it happen. We're going to do check-in rounds at the beginning of our Monday morning meeting, and then do it. You know, make an actual plan for doing it. And the thing is about team habits is that it's never ending. You know, this is something that you need to do on an ongoing basis. So you design the way that you're working, and when you design it, how do you know that it's going to work? You don't know that it's going to work. You don't know it's going to be easy for your team. You don't know that it's going to make an impact. So you're going to test it. You're going to experiment with it. And then you're going to review it, and you'll iterate on that. And then you repeat. This is an ongoing cycle. It's something to stay in contact with your team. Keep on discussing. Keep it front of mind, because the way that you work, according to what you do, is going to change. And also the context that you're working in is going to change as well. These habits aren't going to work. You don't want to get stuck in a process that you're just doing just for the sake of it. You want to review it and make sure that it's really relevant and it's working for the situation that you're in. So what habits do your team have? And what habits can you build or break in your team? So my final point is, going back to that slide, you know, when you want to design a high-performing team, how you work together is more important than what you're working on and even who you're working with. You think about the people in your team, the individuals, how you all like to work. How do you do your best work? have a discussion around that, and then based on that, decide how you're going to work together. Thank you very much.